The inflation genie is out of the bottle. Can we get it back in there before it does too much damage? Central banks are trying to tackle it by racing each other to put up interest rates, possibly to levels we haven't seen in years, despite the fact that we are all leveraged to the hilt with our mortgages. How's that going to work out? And can they do that without causing a recession? And does monetary policy actually do what central bankers think it will? Or is it up to the government to fix the problem, and not by putting up taxes, which is what Rishi Sunak's just done in the UK? In short, is everyone doing exactly the wrong thing? That's today on the Debunking Economics podcast with Professor Steve Keen. I'm Phil Dobbie. Welcome along. Well, before the pandemic, the world was wondering what had happened to inflation, wasn't it? I mean, there was a lot of talk about deflation brought about by the globalization of goods. You know, the production was lowering costs, wages were going down along with lower commodity prices. So in a way, Steve, you know, inflation has kicked in because all those things have been taken away from us, aren't they? We've gone the opposite way. Yeah. Globalization is temporarily broken. Labor supply has been cut short because of COVID. Commodity prices are rising, whereas they were falling before because of all the production has fallen initially because of COVID and then because of the war. So does that mean it could just as easily turn back the other way?
Not because of the fact we're facing supply constraints.
Right, which is what we were talking about last week.
You simply can't, produce oil more cheaply anymore because it just takes more energy to get it out of the ground. And at some point, the energy return on energy investor becomes so low that it's not even worth getting it out.
So is that, which is what we were talking about last week, is that the root cause of all of this then? I mean,
largely, yeah.
Because the other thing is wage push inflation, which we've been seeing because somehow, and no one's quite, I've not heard a sensible explanation of this yet, the Great Resignation, the fact that people are...
A large part of it is because governments are finally running large deficits,
right,
much larger than they should have, than they needed to run over the last 40 years, but they haven't run them. So you've had this diminishing demand pressure coming from a lack of creation of fiat-based money into a fiat-based economy, and therefore that's part of why wages have fallen over time. And then suddenly when COVID hits, deficits of 20% of GDP, enormous monetary demand going out there, turning up as demand for houses, the housing bubbles we're seeing everywhere, and shortages of labour. Okay, because people aren't. I mean, you're not. There isn't a great deal of demand for people to be working in the airline industry right now or the hospitality industry, but there's enormous demand for goods and services.
Right.
So you're saying the government, mainly goods, not services.
So the government has created money, that's created demand, and
and that's giving us part of the wage credit. That's why you can afford to resign right now.
But why wouldn't we be seeing GDP shooting up to astronomical levels? I mean, it has bounced back quite quickly. But
but it's the fastest. I've seen people say it's the fastest recovery in post-war history, actually probably in history.
And that is because of government money.
Because governments spend that amount of money.
Right.
This is why we should learn the lesson from this. Rather late in the maturity of capitalism to learn it. We should learn that government spending boosts economic activity.
Right.
Okay. Now, neoclassical economics tells you government spending reduces economic activity. Okay, because people say, well, there's more spending happening now, therefore there's got to be more taxes in the future to balance it. Therefore, I'll save now, and that offsets the impact of of people spending more money. Well, that's been smashed in the face by reality. With the extra government spending, people are spending more themselves, and there's been an increase in demand.
So you'd say before this we went. So that's why we've got inflation now. Before the pandemic, we had deflation because the opposite was happening. Governments weren't spending. We'd been through 10 years of austerity.
But that's only one of many factors. I mean, as you said, there's also the shift of production to China.
Yeah.
Now that's run its course because when I spend my time in a Chinese city and I then go to an English one, I don't see a huge difference in living standards anymore. The wages and prices are different, but the quality of life of people in general, and trust me, I see far more homeless people on the streets of London than I've ever seen in a Chinese city.
Can you get decent coffee in China though?
Well, okay. There
so I mean, that's all.
You could definitely get a better tea.
You get to say age. That's all you care about.
Maotai. You can't get Maotai like that over here.
Right.
But fundamentally, we've had a deflation pressure from relocating production particularly from America to China.
Yeah.
Okay, that was a huge course.
But they were running out of steam, weren't they? I mean, even before.
They were running out of steam because finally wages have risen sufficiently, living standards are such that China doesn't need that desperate export push anymore.
So because from 2012 to 2016, producer prices in China were actually falling over 5% year on year in 2016. So they were going the other way. So they were on the road to deflation. They climbed out of it, but it was back in negative territory again in 2019 and early 2020. CPI was holding up. So producer prices, the input prices into factories, were going down. CPI was only holding up, and it was fairly flat because of food costs had shot up because of the swine flu. But otherwise, they could have found that CPI was going down as well. So they were basically on the verge of deflation before all of this kicked in. So which is worse, deflation or inflation?
Well, they're both. You generally want a small degree of inflation, because what that actually does is encourage you to spend the money you've got in your bank account.
Yeah.
Okay.
Because then it's going to go down.
It's going to go down. It's like the form of gazillion taxation.
Yeah.
So a small amount is actually beneficial in terms of stimulating a level of demand. You look at the level of the measures of the velocity of money of zero maturity, which is the best guide we've ever produced to the actual money stock, and the velocity used to be it would turn over 1.8 times per year up to the 1970s inflation. It shot right up to about 3. Now it's down below 1.
Yeah.
The Fed stopped producing the figures, but that was the last level.
So deflation would have the opposite. I mean, that would be like a downward spiral. I may as well keep the money in the bank account, because anything I want to buy is going to be cheaper next year.
That's right. So deflation pushes it down even further. Inflation encourages you to spend. So if you want a level of spending, then a small amount of inflation is a good thing. But the inflation we're having now isn't your daddy's inflation. The inflation we had back in the 1970s was a combination of several things. It was, first of all, an absolutely booming economy. So wage rises could be demanded by workers, and you had strong trade unions back then.
Yeah.
So they could bargain on behalf of workers. And you also had, because of the high level of demand, you had incredible pressure on commodity producers. So commodity prices were going up as well. And what you then got was a demand for higher wage payments, demand for higher resource payments, and that caused increase in the money supply, not the other way around. Because as Basil Moore showed brilliantly back with the endogenous money stock paper back in 1979, it's the lines of credit that companies used to have meant that if they got higher wage demands and higher resource demands, they could access like an unused part of their credit card to get the money to pay for it. So what you had was inflation caused by contests over income shares, and that's both income shares between labour and capital in the developed world, and between commodity and non-commodity producing nations in terms of international trade. Then that was a demand-driven inflation, and it also occurred at a time of a huge credit boom. Now, the end of that was actually a credit bust that began in 1974, and that's global. And it wasn't on the scale of what we've been through since, but it was the first credit bust of any real global significance since the Great Depression.
So that credit boom was almost the same idea, of money being pumped into the economy. It just wasn't government money; it was bank money,
private bank money. Yeah. And, I remember this vividly because 1974 I was 21, and Sydney was absolute boomtown at the time. And if you looked from Sydney University over the skyline of Sydney, you just saw kangaroo crane after kangaroo crane, or they're actually Australian inventions, the cranes that are designed to build tall buildings, everywhere, hundreds of them, because there were so many skyscrapers being built at the time in the middle of this huge building boom. It all collapsed in 74. And what you saw was this huge increase in credit-based demand and then negative credit coming out of it. And that happened in America, and it was a global phenomenon. So that was our first real credit bust. So what gave us the stagflation was actually this continued pressure from the booming economy for higher wages and for higher raw material prices. And then with the credit bust wiped out your investment. So you had a continued momentum for price rises while investment had stalled completely because of the collapse of credit.
And we leave this discussion there right now, because if you want to hear the full version of this podcast, you need to become a supporter of Steve Keen on Patreon. Go to patreon.com/Prof Steve Keen, or subscribe at debunkingeconomics.com. Then you can hear this in full and all the other 200 or so other episodes that we've done. That's it for now, though. We'll see you again for the full version, or back next week for another shortened version. I'm Phil Dobbie. He's Steve Keen. Thanks for listening.